Get this satisfies away from my table. Margaret Ashford's diamond-studded fingers gripped the crystal glass. Without warning, she tilted it forward. Red wine cascaded down Marcus Thompson's face, soaking his navy suit, dripping onto the white tablecloth like fresh blood. You people need to learn your place. 300 phones captured every second. The Houston Energy Summit froze. But Margaret didn't notice the Pentagon officials turning pale. She didn't see her husband's face drain of color. The man she'd just humiliated controlled $40 billion in federal energy contracts, and her family needed his signature to survive. She had just destroyed everything. Comment below what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The wine was still dripping from Marcus Thompson's chin when Margaret Ashford smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic smile. The smile of a woman who believed she had just put someone in their proper place. "Security!" she called out, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I'd like this man escorted out. Clearly there's been some mistake with tonight's guest list." Nobody moved. 300 guests stood, frozen champagne glasses suspended mid-air, conversations dead on their lips. The Houston Grand Hyatt's crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across a scene that would soon become the most viral moment in American corporate history. Marcus Thompson reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew a white handkerchief and began dabbing at the wine stains on his face with the precision of a man who had faced far worse than red wine and racial slurs. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in 3 different war zones. "That was a very interesting choice. The only interesting thing here is how you got past security." Margaret turned to the crowd, playing to her audience. "Does anyone know who sponsored this man's attendance? Because I'd like to have a word with them about their vetting process." Richard Ashford was already pushing through the crowd, his face the color of old ash. He had recognized Marcus Thompson the moment his wife approached that table. He had tried to stop her. He had failed. "Margaret." Richard grabbed his wife's elbow. "We need to leave, now." "Leave? I'm not going anywhere, Richard. Someone needed to address this situation, and since you clearly weren't going to—" "Margaret, please, no." She pulled her arm free. "I'm tired of pretending. Tired of watching people like him take seats that belong to families like ours. My grandfather built this industry. My father expanded it. And now we're supposed to smile while they hand our legacy to anyone who checks the right diversity box." The words hung in the air like poison gas. At table 12, Colonel Patricia Hayes leaned toward her colleague from the Department of Energy. "Please tell me she doesn't know who he is." "She clearly doesn't." God help her. Margaret was still performing for the crowd, still basking in what she perceived as her moment of righteous victory. 60 years my family has powered this nation. 60 years of American excellence. And this is what we've come to. Pretending that everyone belongs everywhere. Marcus continued, cleaning his face. Patient, methodical, like he was in no hurry at all. "Are you even going to respond?" Margaret demanded. "Or are you just going to stand there like what, Mrs. Ashford?" The question stopped her cold. "Please." Marcus continued, folding his handkerchief neatly. "Finish your sentence. I'd like the record to be complete." For the first time, something flickered across Margaret's face. Not doubt, she was far too certain for doubt, but awareness that this man wasn't reacting the way he should. He should be embarrassed, humiliated, apologizing for his very presence. Instead, he was studying her like a scientist examining a particularly disappointing specimen. "I don't owe you an explanation," Margaret said finally. "I don't owe you anything." "No," Marcus agreed. "You don't. But you've given me something far more valuable than an explanation, Mrs. Ashford. You've given me clarity." He turned to the Pentagon officials at his table. "I believe we have all the information we need regarding Ashford Energy's corporate culture. Colonel Hayes, please note the time for our report." "Already documented, sir." "Sir." The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Richard Ashford closed his eyes. In that single syllable, He heard the sound of everything his family had built crashing down around him. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've done what needed to be done. I've reminded everyone here that there's still an order to things, a proper way." "That man," Richard said slowly, "is Marcus Thompson. I don't care if he's Marcus Welby. He doesn't belong at a table with military brass and—" "He is the military brass, Margaret. He's Deputy Secretary of Energy. He controls $40 billion in annual contracts." Richard's voice cracked. "And he was here to evaluate us for the renewable energy contract, the one we need to survive." Margaret's face went through several transformations in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, horror. Then something darker, the desperate calculation of someone realizing they've made a catastrophic mistake and searching for any escape. "That's impossible," she said. "He's black?" Marcus offered. "Is that what you're trying to say, Mrs. Ashford? That it's impossible for someone who looks like me to hold a position of authority?" "I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said. And what you said was remarkably clarifying." Around them, phones continued recording. Social media was already exploding. #Winegate was trending before Margaret could even attempt damage control. "Deputy Secretary Thompson." Richard stepped forward, his hands actually shaking. "I cannot begin to apologize enough for my wife's behavior. She doesn't represent our company's values. She doesn't speak for, doesn't she?" Marcus's eyes never left Margaret. "She's the primary shareholder's wife. She's been attending industry events representing your company for 20 years. She sits on 3 of your subsidiary boards. Those are ceremonial positions. Are they because her behavior tonight suggests someone very comfortable wielding power, very practiced at putting people in what she calls their place?" Colonel Hayes stood up. "Deputy Secretary, shall I arrange for Mrs. Ashford to be escorted out?" "That won't be necessary, Colonel. Mrs. Ashford was just demonstrating what she believes about people who look like me. It would be a shame to cut short such an educational performance." The sarcasm was surgical, precise, devastating. Margaret finally found her voice. "Richard, make him stop talking to me like that." "Like what, Margaret? Like you talk to him like you've talked to the servers all night, like you talk to anyone you consider beneath you." This was new. Richard had never spoken to her this way, not in 22 years of marriage. "Richard, do you know what you called him, Margaret? In front of 300 witnesses, in front of Pentagon officials, in front of every energy executive in Houston. I was making a point about— You called him an animal. You poured wine on a decorated military veteran and government official and called him an animal." The reality was finally penetrating Margaret's carefully constructed world. She looked around the ballroom searching for allies. Her friend Caroline looked away. James Morrison from Devon Energy suddenly found his phone fascinating. Even her own cousin Bradley was already heading for the exit. "This is being blown out of proportion," Margaret said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "People are being too sensitive. In my grandfather's day—" "In your grandfather's day," Marcus interrupted quietly, "men who looked like me couldn't vote, couldn't drink from the same fountains, couldn't serve in the same military units. Is that the America you want to return to, Mrs. Ashford?" "I never said that." "You didn't have to. Your actions spoke quite eloquently." Margaret was spiraling now, grasping at anything that might restore her sense of control. "You're taking this personally when it was never about—" "About what?" "About race. You called me a primate. Mrs. Ashford, you questioned my right to sit at a table with real leaders. You assumed that my skin color meant I couldn't possibly belong here. Tell me what exactly wasn't about race." The ballroom had become completely silent, except for the soft clicking of camera phones. The footage would eventually reach 200 million views. Think pieces would be written. Congressional hearings would be held. But in this moment, it was simply a woman being confronted with the ugly reality of her own prejudice. "I want to leave," Margaret said suddenly. "Richard, take me home." "I don't think that's possible right now, Mrs. Ashford." This came from a man Margaret hadn't noticed approach, a stern-faced individual with a federal badge visible on his belt. "The Department of Energy's Inspector General Office will need to speak with you regarding potential civil rights violations at a federally sponsored event. Please don't leave the premises." Civil rights violations: for expressing an opinion, for creating a hostile environment at an official government function, for using racial slurs against a senior government official, for assault. Assault: I threw a glass of wine. You threw a glass of liquid at another person without their consent. In most jurisdictions that qualifies as assault, Mrs. Ashford, particularly when accompanied by racial epithets. Margaret looked at Richard, but he offered no support. His attention was fixed on his phone, where messages were already flooding in. Board members, investors, partners, all asking the same question. "What the hell just happened? Richard?" Margaret pleaded. "Tell them I didn't mean..." "Didn't mean what, Margaret? Because I've watched you treat people like this for 20 years. The only difference tonight is that you finally did it to someone with the power to hold you accountable." The betrayal in her eyes was almost enough to evoke sympathy. Almost. "You're supposed to be on my side. I'm on the side of our children's future, our employees' livelihoods, the 5,000 families who depend on Ashford Energy for their paychecks." Richard's voice hardened. "I'm on the side of everything you just destroyed because you couldn't treat a black man with basic human respect." Marcus had been watching this exchange in silence. Now he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience. "Mr. Ashford, I enlisted in the Army 30 years ago as a private. I earned my commission in the field. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, led troops in combat, and worked my way up through a system that fought me every step of the way." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Every promotion I earned there was someone who said I didn't deserve it. Every position I held there was someone who assumed I got it through affirmative action rather than merit. Every room I walked into there was someone like your wife who looked at me and saw only the color of my skin." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not finished, Mrs. Ashford. You asked me what my qualifications were. Let me tell you, I have a master's degree in nuclear engineering from MIT. I have a PhD in energy policy from Stanford. I served on the Joint Chiefs Advisory Council. I helped develop the strategic energy framework that reduced America's dependence on foreign oil by 30%. Each credential landed like a hammer blow. I've been tested by prejudice my entire life, Mrs. Ashford. I've been called every name you can imagine by people who thought they were better than me simply because they were born white. Do you know what your attack taught me about you?" Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. "Nothing I didn't already suspect. Character isn't revealed in moments of comfort, Mrs. Ashford. It's revealed in moments like this. When someone believes there are no consequences for their actions. When they feel free to show who they really are." He straightened his wine-stained jacket. "Your wife showed me exactly who she is tonight, Mr. Ashford. And by extension, she showed me exactly who Ashford Energy is. The question now is whether there's anything left worth saving." He turned and walked toward the exit, Colonel Hayes and the other officials falling into step behind him. Margaret watched him go, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done. But understanding wasn't enough. Would never be enough. Because in one evening, in one moment of unveiled hatred, she had accomplished what decades of competition couldn't. She had destroyed her family's 60-year legacy, and she had done it in front of 300 witnesses with camera phones. Richard's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and went even paler. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "The board. They're calling an emergency meeting." He looked at his wife with something close to hatred. "For tomorrow morning." "Richard, I can fix this. I can apologize. I can..." "You can do nothing, Margaret. Nothing except watch everything burn." He walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the silent ballroom, wine stains spreading across the white tablecloth like a prophecy of the destruction to come. Margaret Ashford had always believed that privilege was permanent. that family names and old money created an impenetrable shield against consequence. She was about to learn how wrong she was. And in offices across America, in boardrooms, and government agencies and military installations, a new word was being added to the corporate vocabulary, Ashforded. To destroy everything through a single act of racist arrogance. It was a lesson Margaret had just taught the entire nation. Whether she would survive the teaching remained to be seen. Richard Ashford didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office watching his phone light up every 30 seconds with another notification. Another news alert. Another board member demanding answers. Another investor threatening to pull out. By 2 a.m., the videos had been viewed 40 million times. By 4 a.m., that number had doubled. By sunrise, Margaret Ashford's face was on every major news network in America. Billionaire's wife attacks black official at Houston gala. Ashford Energy heir uses racial slurs against deputy secretary. Winegate, the moment that destroyed a dynasty. Richard scrolled through the headlines with the numb detachment of a man watching his own execution. His wife was upstairs, sedated after spending 3 hours insisting that everyone was overreacting, that this would blow over, that people were too sensitive these days. She still didn't understand. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's name, Harold Ashford, 82 years old, founder of the company. The man who had built Ashford Energy from a single oil well in West Texas into one of America's largest energy conglomerates. "Dad, tell me it's not true." Harold's voice was hoarse. "Tell me that video is fake. Tell me my daughter-in-law didn't just call a black government official an animal in front of 300 people. Richard closed his eyes. "I can't tell you that." Silence on the line. Then, "Do you know who Marcus Thompson is, Richard? Do you have any idea who that woman attacked?" "I know now. He was a lieutenant colonel when I met him 15 years ago. Brilliant young officer. Everyone knew he was going places." Harold's voice cracked. "I shook his hand at a Pentagon ceremony. Congratulated him on his promotion. He remembered my name, Richard. Remembered our company. Said he admired what we'd built." "Dad? And now your wife has called him a monkey, poured wine on him, in front of the entire Houston energy establishment." Harold's breathing was labored. 60 years, Richard. 60 years I spent building this company. Your grandfather started with nothing. Nothing. And Margaret just burned it all down because she couldn't keep her racist mouth shut. We can recover from this. We can't recover from anything. Don't you understand? Thompson controls the Renewable Energy Initiative. Every major contract for the next decade runs through his office. And you married a woman who thinks it's acceptable to humiliate black people in public. Richard had no response. "Board meeting is at 9 a.m. Harold continued. "I'm flying in tonight. And Richard, don't bring Margaret. Don't let her anywhere near that building. If I see her face, I cannot be held responsible for what I might say." The line went dead. Richard sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in his hand. Through the window, he could see the first light of dawn breaking over Houston. A new day. The first day of the end of everything. Upstairs, Margaret was still sleeping, still oblivious, still certain that her name and her family's money would protect her from consequence. She had no idea what was coming. The board meeting started at exactly 9 a.m. Richard walked into the Ashford Energy conference room to find every seat filled. 12 board members, 3 company lawyers, his father looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. And in the corner, 2 representatives from their largest institutional investor, BlackRock. "Sit down, Richard." Harold's voice was ice. Richard sat. "Let's start with the numbers." Patricia Volkov, the CFO, pulled up a chart on the screen. As of market open this morning, Ashford Energy stock has dropped 31%. We've lost approximately $4.2 billion in market capitalization. Murmurs around the table. "That's just the beginning," Patricia continued. I've received calls from 6 major institutional investors this morning. 3 are demanding emergency meetings. 2 are already filing to divest. 1. She paused, looking at the BlackRock representatives, is here to discuss their position directly. The older of the 2 BlackRock executives, a silver-haired man named Douglas Chen, cleared his throat. BlackRock holds 11% of Ashford Energy. As of this morning, we've placed a hold on any additional investment pending resolution of this situation. If we don't see immediate decisive action, we will begin divesting our position. What kind of action? Richard asked. We'll get to that. Harold cut in. First, let's hear from legal. Thomas, what are we looking at? Thomas Brennan. The company's chief counsel opened a thick folder. Multiple potential liabilities. First, the EEOC has opened a preliminary investigation into Ashford Energy's workplace culture. They're looking at Margaret's behavior as potential evidence of systemic discrimination within the company. She doesn't work for the company, Richard protested. She sits on 3 subsidiary boards. She attends every major company function. She's quoted in our annual reports. In the eyes of the law, she represents Ashford Energy. Thomas turned a page. Second, we're looking at potential civil liability. Deputy Secretary Thompson hasn't filed suit yet, but his office has made no statement either way. A civil rights lawsuit from a sitting government official would be devastating. And third, Harold asked. Third is the contracts. I've been on the phone with the Department of Energy's legal team all morning. They're conducting a formal review of all existing Ashford Energy contracts for potential termination under the federal non-discrimination clauses. The room went silent. How many contracts? Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. All of them, sir. $12 billion in active federal contracts, all under review. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. $12 billion, the lifeblood of the company. And every single contract was now at risk because his wife couldn't control her racism for one evening. There's more, Thomas said reluctantly. The renewable energy contract we were pursuing, the one worth $1.5 billion over 10 years. What about it? Deputy Secretary Thompson's office released a statement 30 minutes ago. The contract has been awarded to Chevron. Harold slammed his fist on the table. 60 years. 60 goddamn years of work, and she destroyed it in 60 seconds. Dad? Don't dad me, Richard. You married her. You enabled her. You watched her treat people like garbage for 2 decades and said nothing because you were afraid of confrontation. Harold's eyes were blazing. I tried to warn you. Your mother tried to warn you. Everyone saw what she was except you. That's not fair. Not fair. You want to talk about fair. Ask the 5,000 employees who might lose their jobs because of your wife's behavior. Ask the shareholders who just lost $4 billion. Ask my grandson what it's like to watch his family's legacy destroyed because his grandmother is a racist. Richard had nothing to say to that. Douglas Chen from BlackRock spoke up. Mr. Ashford Harold, we don't need to assign blame right now. We need to focus on solutions. What concrete steps is Ashford Energy prepared to take? Harold looked at Richard with something close to hatred. Then he turned to the board. I've prepared a proposal. I'd like to bring it to a vote. What kind of proposal? Richard asked. Harold slid a document across the table. Richard picked it up and felt his blood turn to ice. You can't be serious. Read it out loud, Richard. Let the board hear. Richard's hands were shaking. Resolution to remove Margaret Ashford from all positions within Ashford Energy subsidiaries. Resolution to issue a formal statement disavowing her actions and views. Resolution to freeze all trust payments to Margaret Ashford pending investigation. Resolution to... He stopped. Keep reading. Resolution to recommend that Richard Ashford pursue immediate legal separation from Margaret Ashford as a condition of retaining his position as CEO. The room erupted. Harold, you can't force a man to divorce his wife. This is a corporate overreach. The board doesn't have authority over personal matters. Quiet. Harold's voice cut through the noise. I'm not forcing anything. I'm making a recommendation. Richard can choose to stay married to that woman if he wants, but if he does, he'll do it without this company. Richard stared at his father. You're asking me to choose between my wife and my job. I'm asking you to choose between your wife and 5,000 jobs. Between your wife and 60 years of family legacy. Between your wife and everything your grandfather built. Harold leaned forward. She called a black man a monkey Richard. She poured wine on his head. She did it gleefully, triumphantly, like she was proud of herself. And then she went home and gave interviews defending her behavior. She was drinking. She was stressed about the company's finances. Don't. Harold's voice was deadly quiet. Don't you dare make excuses for her. Alcohol doesn't create racism. It reveals it. Stress doesn't generate hatred. It exposes what was already there. Richard looked around the table searching for allies. He found none. I need time to think about this. You have until tomorrow morning, Harold said. The board will vote at 9 a.m. If you're still married to Margaret Ashford at that time, the resolution will include your removal as CEO. The meeting adjourned. Richard walked out of the building in a daze. His phone was still buzzing, more notifications, more headlines, more demands for comment. He ignored them all. His driver was waiting at the curb. Home, sir. No. Richard couldn't face Margaret right now. Couldn't listen to her excuses, her rationalizations, her absolute refusal to accept responsibility. Take me to the Four Seasons. Sir. I need to think, James. Just take me somewhere quiet. The car pulled away from Ashford Tower. In the rearview mirror, Richard watched the building recede, the headquarters his grandfather had built, the empire his father had expanded, the legacy his wife had just destroyed. He had 24 hours to make the hardest decision of his life. Meanwhile, in their memorial mansion, Margaret Ashford was giving another interview. I want to be clear, she said to the Fox News camera sitting in her perfectly decorated living room with her perfectly styled hair and her perfect pearls. I have nothing against black people. Some of my closest friends are black. The interviewer, a blonde woman with a practiced smile, nodded sympathetically. But critics are saying your comments were racist, Mrs. Ashford, that your actions were inexcusable. That's the problem with America today. Margaret leaned forward earnestly. You can't say anything without being called racist. I wasn't attacking his race. I was questioning his credentials. There's a difference. You called him a slur, Mrs. Ashford. You poured wine on his head. I was making a point about merit versus quotas. This country was built on achievement, not handouts. My family earned everything we have. We didn't get special treatment because of how we look. The interview was being broadcast live. Across America, jaws dropped. In his hotel room at the Four Seasons, Richard watched his wife dig their grave even deeper. Each word was another shovel of dirt. Each justification was another nail in the coffin. His phone rang. His sister, Elizabeth. Are you watching this? Unfortunately. Richard, she's making it worse. Every word out of her mouth is making it worse. Can't you stop her? I'm at the Four Seasons. I haven't been home since the board meeting. The board meeting where Dad asked you to choose between her and the company. News travels fast. Richard, listen to me. Elizabeth's voice softened. I know you love her. Or at least I know you used to love her. But this isn't about love anymore. This is about survival. The company's survival. Our employees' survival. Your children's future. I know. Do you? Because right now Margaret is on live television telling America that she's not racist while using the most racist defense imaginable. Some of my closest friends are black. Jesus Christ, Richard. Does she hear herself? On the screen, Margaret was still talking. The real victim here is me. I'm being attacked for standing up for traditional American values, for speaking the truth, for refusing to bow to political correctness. Elizabeth groaned. Turn it off, Richard. I can't watch anymore. I can't look away. Then at least call the house and tell someone to get her away from that camera. Every second she speaks, she's destroying what little chance we have of salvaging this." Richard hung up and dialed home. One of the housekeepers answered. "Maria, I need you to tell Mrs. Ashford that the interview needs to end. Now." "Sir, Mrs. Ashford specifically told us not to interrupt." "I don't care what she said. Turn off the cameras, escort the crew out, and tell my wife that her husband demands she stop talking, immediately." There was a commotion on the other end. Richard could hear Margaret's voice rising in anger. Then the line went dead. He stared at the phone, then back at the television. The Fox News anchor was apologizing to viewers. "We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties with our feed from the Ashford residence. We'll try to reconnect shortly." At least Maria had done something right. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Emily, 24 years old, and fresh out of Harvard Business School. She was supposed to join Ashford Energy next month. Start learning the family business. Eventually take over. Now she was texting, "Dad, what do we do?" He didn't have an answer. 3 hours later, Richard's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize but somehow knew was important. "Mr. Ashford, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes from Deputy Secretary Thompson's office." Richard's heart stopped. "Yes, the Deputy Secretary would like to meet with you, privately. Tonight. 8 p.m. There's a small restaurant in Midtown called Bernard's. The Deputy Secretary will be waiting." "Can I ask what this is about?" "I think you know what it's about, Mr. Ashford. The question is whether you're prepared to listen." The line went dead. Richard arrived at Bernard's at exactly 7:55 p.m. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few scattered diners and a piano player working through soft jazz standards in the corner. Marcus Thompson was already seated at a corner table, a glass of red wine in front of him. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Mr. Ashford," Marcus gestured to the empty chair. "Thank you for coming." Richard sat down. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see anyone named Ashford ever again." "I didn't want to see your wife. You, on the other hand—" Marcus took a sip of his wine. "You interest me." "Interest you how?" "Because you're at a crossroads, Mr. Ashford, and the choice you make in the next 24 hours will determine whether your family's company survives or disappears." Richard waited. "Let me tell you a story," Marcus continued. "When I was 18 years old, I enlisted in the army. Not because I wanted to serve, though I came to want that later, but because I had no other options. My father was gone. My mother worked 2 jobs. College wasn't something people like me got to do." He paused, swirling his wine. "Basic training was in Fort Benning, Georgia. Do you know what that was like for a young black man in 1989? "I can imagine." "No, Mr. Ashford. You can't." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't imagine waking up every day knowing that half the people around you thought you didn't belong. You can't imagine having to be twice as good just to be considered half as qualified. You can't imagine the things that were said to me done to me by people who looked at my skin and saw nothing else." Richard lowered his eyes. "But I stayed. I worked harder than anyone else. I studied longer. I trained more. And slowly, painfully, I rose through the ranks. Lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, general, and now deputy secretary." Marcus set down his glass. "Do you know what your wife's attack taught me about Ashford Energy? That we have a racism problem. That you have a leadership problem. Racism doesn't exist in a vacuum, Mr. Ashford. It's nurtured by silence, by complicity, by people who see evil and say nothing because speaking up is uncomfortable." He leaned forward. "Your wife has been behaving this way for years. Everyone knows it. And no one, not you, not your father, not your board, did anything about it." Richard felt the weight of the accusation. Because it was true. He had watched Margaret treat service workers like dirt. He had listened to her casual racism at dinner parties. He had made excuses, changed the subject, looked the other way. And now it had cost them everything. "Why did you want to meet with me?" Richard asked. To tell me what a failure I am because I already know. No. Marcus's voice softened slightly. I wanted to meet with you because I believe in redemption. Not easy redemption, not the kind where you apologize and everything goes back to normal. Real redemption, the kind that costs something. What do you mean? Tomorrow the Department of Energy will announce a full review of all Ashford Energy contracts. If that review finds evidence of systemic discrimination, and based on what I saw at that gala, I expect those contracts will be terminated. Richard's stomach dropped. But, Marcus continued, if Ashford Energy demonstrates a genuine commitment to change, not just words but action, I might be willing to recommend a more measured response. What kind of action? Complete cultural transformation, independent oversight, diversity initiatives with real teeth, and most importantly, he paused, complete separation from Margaret Ashford. Not just removal from company positions, complete separation. Richard understood. You're asking me to divorce my wife. I'm asking you to choose what kind of man you want to be, what kind of legacy you want to leave. Marcus finished his wine. Your grandfather built something remarkable, Mr. Ashford. Your father expanded it. The question is whether you're going to let your wife's hatred destroy it, or whether you're going to have the courage to cut out the cancer and save what can be saved. And if I don't... Marcus stood up, placing a $20 bill on the table. Then Ashford Energy becomes a cautionary tale, a case study in how racism destroys everything it touches, and your children inherit nothing but shame. He walked toward the door, then paused. I was raised to believe that people can change, Mr. Ashford. That character is a choice we make every day. Tomorrow, you'll have the chance to show me what you choose. And then he was gone, leaving Richard alone with a decision that would define the rest of his life. Richard Ashford didn't go home that night. He sat in his hotel room until dawn, watching the lights of Houston twinkle below, thinking about legacy and love and the terrible cost of silence. At 6 a.m., he called his lawyer. Draw up divorce papers. I want them ready by noon. At 7 a.m., he called his daughter. Emily, I need you to know that what I'm about to do, I'm doing for you, for your brother, for everyone who depends on this company. At 8 a.m., he put on his suit, straightened his tie, and walked out to face whatever came next. The board meeting was in 1 hour, and Richard Ashford had finally made his choice. Richard walked into the Ashford Energy boardroom at exactly 8:47 a.m. Every head turned. 12 board members, 3 lawyers, his father, at the head of the table. The same faces from yesterday, but something had changed. They were looking at him differently now, waiting, wondering which Richard Ashford had shown up. You're early. Harold's voice was neutral, guarded. I have something to say before we vote. Richard walked to the front of the room. He placed a manila folder on the table, the divorce papers his lawyer had rushed to prepare at 6 a.m. I spent last night thinking about legacy, about what my grandfather built, about what my father protected, about what I've been too weak to defend. He paused, meeting his father's eyes. I met with Deputy Secretary Thompson last night. Murmurs around the table. He told me something I already knew but refused to admit. Margaret's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease I've been enabling for 22 years. Harold leaned forward slightly. Richard. Let me finish, Dad, please. Richard opened the folder. These are divorce papers. I'm filing them today. Margaret will be served before noon. The room went silent. I'm also announcing a complete restructuring of Ashford Energy's corporate culture. Independent oversight. Mandatory diversity training for all leadership. New hiring practices. New promotion criteria. Not because the government is forcing us to, but because it's the right thing to do. Douglas Chen from BlackRock nodded slowly. This is exactly the kind of decisive action we were hoping to see. There's more. Richard's voice hardened. I want a full investigation into every discrimination complaint that's ever been filed against this company. Every settlement we've quietly paid. Every employee we've silenced. I want it all on the table. Thomas Brennan, the chief counsel, shifted uncomfortably. Richard, that could expose us to significant liability. I don't care. We've been hiding from our failures for too long. It stops today. Harold stood up slowly. His eyes were wet. Richard, I know I've disappointed you, Dad. I know I should have stood up to her years ago. I knew what she was, and I stayed silent because it was easier. Because confrontation felt too hard. Richard's voice cracked. But I'm not staying silent anymore. The vote was unanimous. Margaret Ashford was stripped of all positions within Ashford Energy subsidiaries. Her trust fund was frozen. A public statement was drafted disavowing her actions and views. And Richard Ashford retained his position as CEO on the condition that the divorce proceeded. The meeting ended at 10:15 a.m. Richard's next stop was home. He found Margaret in the living room watching herself on the morning news. The coverage was brutal clip after clip of her wine-pouring attack, followed by analysis from legal experts predicting federal charges. Richard, she barely looked up. Tell me you fixed this. Tell me you've made them understand that I was provoked. Provoked by what, Margaret, a black man sitting at a table? Don't start with me. I've had enough criticism from the media. I don't need it from my own husband. Richard sat down across from her. I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to say is going to be difficult to hear. If this is about the interviews, I've already agreed to stop. I'm filing for divorce. Margaret froze. Her hand, reaching for her coffee cup, stopped mid-air. What did you say? I'm filing for divorce. Today. The papers will be served within the hour. She laughed. Actually laughed. You're joking. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Richard, we've been married for 22 years. We have children together. You can't just... I can. And I am. Richard kept his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. What you did at that gala wasn't a mistake, Margaret. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was who you are, who you've always been. How dare you? Margaret's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. After everything I've done for this family, everything I've sacrificed. What have you sacrificed? Your dignity? You never had any. Your principles? You abandoned those years ago. Richard leaned forward. Do you know what you've cost us, Margaret? $4 billion in market value. $12 billion in contracts under review. 5,000 jobs at risk. And why? Because you couldn't treat a black man like a human being for one evening. That man was out of place. That man was the Deputy Secretary of Energy. He controls $40 billion in federal contracts. And you poured wine on him because his skin was the wrong color. Margaret stood up abruptly. I won't listen to this. I won't sit here and be lectured by my own husband about racism, about basic human decency, about the fact that you called a decorated military veteran an animal. Richard stood too, matching her anger with his own. You know what the worst part is, Margaret? I knew. I've always known what you are. And I said nothing. For 22 years, I watched you treat people like garbage, and I made excuses because it was easier than confronting you. So this is my fault. Everything that's wrong with our marriage is my fault. This isn't about our marriage anymore. This is about survival. The company's survival. Our children's future. Richard pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. Do you see these numbers? 31% stock drop. $4.2 billion gone. Because of you. Margaret slapped the phone out of his hand. Those numbers mean nothing. The market will recover. It always does. Not this time. The Department of Energy is reviewing every contract we have, every single one. If they find evidence of systemic discrimination, and they will, Margaret, because you're not the only racist thing about this company, they'll terminate everything. Then we'll sue. We'll fight. With what our reputation is destroyed. Our partners are abandoning us. Even BlackRock is threatening to divest. Richard picked up his phone from the floor. Deputy Secretary Thompson offered me a chance last night. One chance to save what's left of this company. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You met with him after what he's trying to do to us. He's not trying to do anything to us. You did this, Margaret. You and your hatred and your absolute inability to see black people as human beings. I am not a racist. You called him a monkey. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's face went through several transformations. Anger, defiance, then something almost like shame before the defiance returned. That was taken out of context. There is no context that makes that acceptable. None. Zero. Richard grabbed his jacket from the chair. The divorce papers will be served today. You'll receive a settlement offer from my lawyers by end of week. I suggest you accept it because if this goes to trial, every piece of evidence about who you really are will become public record. You wouldn't. I would. I have to. Richard paused at the door. I loved you once, Margaret. Or I thought I did. Maybe I just loved the idea of you, the perfect wife, the perfect family, the perfect life. But there's nothing perfect about hatred, and I won't let you destroy everything my family built because you can't see past skin color. Richard, wait. But he was already gone. Margaret stood alone in the living room, the morning news still playing in the background. Her own face stared back at her from the screen, frozen in the moment of pouring wine on Marcus Thompson's head. For the first time since the gala, she felt something other than righteous indignation. She felt fear. The divorce papers arrived at 11:43 a.m. Margaret was in her dressing room, trying to decide what to wear for her next interview. A sympathetic podcast host had offered her a platform to tell her side of the story when Maria knocked on the door. Mrs. Ashford, there's a man here. He says he has documents that require your signature. Tell him to leave them with Richard's office. He says they're for you, ma'am, personally. Margaret sighed and went downstairs. A young man in a cheap suit was waiting in the foyer, a manila envelope in his hand. Mrs. Margaret Ashford. Yes. You've been served. He placed the envelope in her hand before she could react. Have a good day, ma'am. Margaret tore open the envelope. The words blurred together, at first legal jargon citations, formalities, but the meaning was clear. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Richard wasn't bluffing. She reached for her phone and called her father-in-law. Harold had always had a soft spot for her. Surely he would talk some sense into Richard. Margaret. Harold's voice was ice. I was wondering when you'd call. Harold, Richard has lost his mind. He's filed for divorce. You have to talk to him. I don't have to do anything, Margaret, and Richard hasn't lost his mind. He's finally found it. How can you say that? After everything I've done for this family, what have you done? Margaret attended charity galas, spent money, looked pretty on Richard's arm. Harold's contempt was palpable. My wife worked beside me for 40 years. She knew every employee's name. She visited their families when they were sick. She treated people, all people, with dignity. I've always been dignified. You called a black man a monkey in front of 300 witnesses. That's not dignity, Margaret. That's depravity. Margaret felt her control slipping. Harold, please. I know I made a mistake. I'm willing to apologize. I'll do whatever it takes. It's too late for apologies. It was too late the moment you picked up that wine glass. Harold's voice hardened. I've watched you for 20 years, Margaret. Watched you look down on anyone you considered beneath you. Watched you treat service workers like dirt. Watched you make comments at dinner parties that made my skin crawl. I never, you did, constantly. And we all stayed silent because you were Richard's wife, because confronting you was uncomfortable, because we were cowards. Harold paused. But I'm not staying silent anymore. You're poison, Margaret. You've poisoned my son, you've poisoned my company, and if we don't cut you out, you'll poison everything else too. You can't do this to me. I have rights. I'll fight this divorce with everything I have. then you'll lose. Because every piece of evidence about who you really are will come out in court. Every settlement we've paid to employees you harassed. Every complaint that's been filed against you. Every witness who's watched you treat people like animals for the past 2 decades. Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. And when it's over, you won't just be divorced. You'll be unhireable, uninvitable, a pariah in every circle that ever mattered to you. The line went dead. Margaret sat down heavily on the stairs, the divorce papers clutched in her hand. Her perfect life was unraveling thread by thread, and she had no idea how to stop it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Caroline. "Margaret, I don't think we should have lunch tomorrow. Or ever again, actually. I'm sorry. This is just too toxic." Another buzz. "James Morrison from Devon Energy. Please remove my wife's number from your contacts. We won't be attending any events where you might be present." Another, and another, and another. One by one, the people Margaret had considered friends were abandoning her. Not because they disagreed with what she'd done, some of them probably agreed with every word, but because association with her had become too costly, too dangerous. She was being erased from polite society, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. 2 weeks later, the divorce proceedings began in earnest. Margaret had hired the most expensive family lawyer in Houston, a woman named Sandra Vance, who had represented CEOs, politicians, and celebrities in some of the messiest divorces in Texas history. "Let me be blunt, Mrs. Ashford." Sandra spread papers across her conference table. "This is going to be difficult. Your husband has public opinion on his side. He has the company on his side. He has the evidence on his side." "What evidence? I haven't done anything illegal." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "You poured wine on a government official and called him a racial slur. On video. That's assault and potential civil rights violations at a federally sponsored event. It was wine, not acid. The law doesn't distinguish as much as you'd like it to." Sandra pulled out a folder. "More importantly, your husband's legal team has been busy. They've compiled a list of incidents over the past 20 years. Discrimination complaints from household staff. Recorded comments at company events. Testimony from former employees about hostile work environments you allegedly created." Margaret's face went pale. "Those are lies, exaggerations. Some of them might be, but all of them. With witnesses, with documentation." Sandra shook her head. "Your husband isn't just filing for divorce. Mrs. Ashford, he's building a case that you're an unfit spouse, an unfit mother, and a liability to everyone associated with you. He can't use the children against me. Your children are adults, Mrs. Ashford. Emily is 24, Thomas is 21. They can testify if they choose to." "They would never." "Have you spoken to them since the gala?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. "I see." Sandra leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Ashford, I need you to be honest with me. Not for legal reasons, for strategic ones. Is there anything else that might come out? Anything your husband might know about? Any other incidents I should be prepared for?" Margaret thought about the Guatemalan housekeeper she'd fired for stealing jewelry that was later found in Margaret's own closet. About the black gardener she'd accused of casing the house when he asked to use the bathroom. About the Asian caterer whose work she'd refused to pay because the egg rolls were too ethnic. "Nothing significant," Margaret said. Sandra didn't believe her. It was written all over her face. But she nodded and closed her folder. "Very well. I'll do what I can. But I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this divorce is going to be painful, public, and very, very expensive." "How expensive?" "Given your husband's resources and determination, you might walk away with the prenuptial minimum, which, given the circumstances, would be generous." Margaret felt something break inside her. The prenuptial minimum, well, $3 million. In her world, that was practically poverty. "There has to be something we can do, some leverage we can use." "The only leverage you had was public sympathy, And you destroyed that with your interviews. Sandra's voice softened slightly. Mrs. Ashford, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen people in much better positions than yours lose everything because they couldn't admit they were wrong. Your best chance, your only chance, is to show genuine remorse, to accept responsibility, to demonstrate that you understand why what you did was wrong. So you want me to lie? Sandra stared at her for a long moment. That's exactly the kind of statement that makes this case unwinnable. Good luck, Mrs. Ashford. I'll be in touch. 3 days later, Sandra Vance withdrew from the case. Her official reason was irreconcilable differences in legal strategy. The real reason was that Margaret had called Sandra's black paralegal the help during a meeting. Margaret was running out of allies. Meanwhile, Richard was moving forward. He announced the formation of the Ashford Energy Transformation Initiative at a press conference that drew national attention. Standing beside him were Dr. Maya Johnson, a renowned diversity consultant, and 2 representatives from the NAACP. What happened at the Houston Energy Summit was a symptom of a deeper problem. Richard told the assembled reporters, "Not just within my family, but within our company and our industry. Today, we begin the work of addressing that problem." He outlined a comprehensive plan. Independent audits of hiring practices, mandatory bias training for all employees, new partnerships with historically black colleges and universities, and a $50 million fund to support minority entrepreneurs in the energy sector. Some will say this is just PR, Richard continued, that we're trying to buy our way out of controversy. But I want to be clear. These changes are not about optics. They're about who we want to be as a company and as Americans. Dr. Johnson stepped to the microphone. I've worked with dozens of corporations on diversity initiatives. Most of them are superficial checkbox exercises designed to avoid lawsuits. What Ashford Energy is proposing is different. It's structural, it's measurable, and it's the most ambitious transformation plan I've ever seen from a company this size. Reporters shouted questions. Richard, what about your wife? Have you spoken to her? My personal matters are being handled through the appropriate legal channels. Today is about the company and its future. Is it true that Deputy Secretary Thompson offered to reduce penalties if you divorced your wife? Deputy Secretary Thompson and I have had productive conversations about what genuine change looks like. The details of those conversations are private. Do you believe your wife is racist? Richard paused. The question hung in the air. Cameras flashed. I believe my wife holds views that are incompatible with the values this company wants to represent. I believe her actions caused tremendous harm to Deputy Secretary Thompson, to our employees, and to our reputation. And I believe that meaningful change requires accountability from all of us. It wasn't a direct answer, but it was enough. The press conference made national news. Richard Ashford was being hailed as a profile in courage, a man who had chosen principle over marriage, company over comfort. Op-eds praised his willingness to confront racism in his own family. Margaret watched the coverage from her memorial mansion alone, except for the skeleton staff she could still afford. Most of her household employees had quit either out of solidarity with the people she'd demeaned over the years, or out of fear of being associated with her toxicity. Her phone was silent now. The endless stream of texts and calls had dried up. Even the sympathetic podcasters who had wanted to give her a platform had moved on to other controversies. She was becoming what she had always feared most: invisible. The final hearing was scheduled for Thursday. Margaret's new lawyer, a younger, less expensive man named Derek Walsh, had done his best, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Richard had the evidence, the public support, and the resources to make this divorce as painful as possible. The court has reviewed the prenuptial agreement and finds it valid and enforceable, the judge announced. Given the circumstances of this case, specifically the documented instances of conduct that materially damaged the family business, the court is inclined to enforce the minimum provisions. Margaret's hands were shaking. $3 million, 22 years of marriage, and she was walking away with $3 million. Additionally, the judge continued, the court notes that Mrs. Ashford's behavior has had measurable negative impact on Ashford Energy's stock price, contract portfolio, and reputation. While the prenuptial agreement limits direct claims, the court finds that Mr. Ashford is entitled to offset the marital settlement by documented damages. Derek leaned over. That means they're deducting business losses from your settlement. How much? Potentially all of it. The judge finished reading the terms. After offsets, legal fees, and various deductions, Margaret Ashford would receive approximately $400,000. From billionaire's wife to something barely above middle class. In 6 weeks. Do you have anything to say, Mrs. Ashford? Margaret stood slowly. This was her last chance. Her final opportunity to show remorse, to demonstrate growth, to prove that she was capable of change. Your Honor, I believe this entire proceeding has been fundamentally unfair. I made one mistake at one event, and I'm being punished as if I committed murder. The man I supposedly assaulted hasn't even filed charges. This is character assassination dressed up as justice. Derek put his head in his hands. The judge's expression hardened. Mrs. Ashford, you poured wine on a senior government official while using racial slurs. You then spent 2 weeks on national television defending your actions. Your husband has presented evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning 2 decades. And even now, standing in this courtroom, you refuse to take responsibility. I take responsibility for the wine. I don't take responsibility for being treated like a criminal for expressing an opinion. Your opinion, the judge said slowly, was that a decorated military veteran didn't deserve to sit at a table because of the color of his skin. That's not an opinion, Mrs. Ashford. That's bigotry. And while bigotry isn't illegal, its consequences are not protected by law. She signed the divorce papers that afternoon. Her hand trembled as she wrote her name, knowing that she was signing away everything she had ever known. Margaret Ashford walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of reporters and cameras. Microphones were thrust in her face. Questions were shouted. Flashbulbs blinded her. Mrs. Ashford, any comment on the settlement? Margaret, do you regret what you did at the gala? Have you spoken to Deputy Secretary Thompson? Will you apologize? She pushed through the crowd without answering, climbed into a waiting car, and watched the courthouse recede in the rear window. Her driver glanced at her in the mirror. Where to, ma'am? Margaret opened her mouth to say the Memorial Mansion address, then remembered. That wasn't her home anymore. Nothing was her home anymore. Just drive, she said. I don't care where. The car pulled away, leaving Margaret Ashford to contemplate the ruins of a life she had destroyed with her own hatred. And somewhere across Houston, Marcus Thompson was reading a report about the transformation of Ashford Energy, nodding slowly at the changes being implemented in his name. Justice, he had learned long ago, was not about revenge. It was about consequence. And Margaret Ashford was finally learning what consequences looked like. The studio apartment in Oakland was 800 square feet. Margaret stood in the doorway, her single suitcase at her feet, staring at the space that would now be her life. A Murphy bed that folded into the wall. A kitchenette with a 2-burner stove. A bathroom so small she could touch both walls with outstretched arms. The lease is month to month, the property manager said, a young woman with purple hair and a nose ring who clearly had no idea who Margaret was. First and last month up front, plus security deposit. Utilities included. Fine. You need to fill out the application. Employment verification references, credit check. I'll pay 6 months in advance, cash. The property manager shrugged. Works for me. Margaret handed over the money, $18,000, a sum that would have been her daily spending allowance just 2 months ago. Now it represented a significant portion of what remained after lawyers' settlements and the desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of her former life. The property manager left. Margaret closed the door and stood alone in her new reality. No housekeeper to clean. No chef to cook. No driver to transport her. No assistants. No staff. No one to manage the 1,000 small details that had always been managed for her. She didn't even know how to use the washing machine. Margaret sat down on the bare mattress and cried. Not elegant tears, the kind she'd practiced for charity events and society funerals. These were ugly, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. She cried for an hour, then 2. Then she stopped because there was no one to comfort her and no point in continuing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emily, her daughter. The first communication in 3 weeks. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow?" Margaret's heart leaped. Emily. Her daughter still wanted to see her. Maybe there was hope after all. "Of course. Anywhere you want. Name the place." "There's a coffee shop in Berkeley. Cafe Milano, 2 p.m. "I'll be there." Margaret set down the phone with trembling hands. Tomorrow. She would see her daughter tomorrow. She would explain. She would make Emily understand that everything had been blown out of proportion, that she wasn't the monster the media had made her out to be. She would fix this. She had to. Emily was already seated when Margaret arrived. 24 years old. Harvard MBA. The daughter Margaret had groomed to be perfect. The right schools, the right friends, the right accomplishments. Looking at her now, Margaret felt a surge of pride. At least she had done something right. Emily. Margaret moved to hug her daughter. Emily held up a hand. "Sit down, Mom, please." The coldness in her voice stopped Margaret mid-step. She sat. "Thank you for coming," Emily said formally. "I wanted to have this conversation in person." "Of course, sweetheart. I've missed you so much. These past weeks have been—" "Mom, I need you to listen. Really listen. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, though something in Emily's tone made her stomach clench. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the gala. A lot of remembering." Emily's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup, like she was drawing strength from its warmth. "Do you remember my friend Jasmine from high school?" "Jasmine." Margaret searched her memory. "The girl who came to your 16th birthday party." "She didn't just come to my birthday party, Mom. She was my best friend. We did everything together, studied together, ate lunch together, planned to room together at college." Margaret vaguely recalled a black girl who had spent time at their house. Pretty thing, well-spoken for her background. "What about her?" "You made me stop being friends with her." "I did no such thing." "You told me she wasn't our kind of people. You said her presence at our house made the neighbors uncomfortable. You said that girls like her could be useful connections, but shouldn't be confused with real friends." Margaret felt her face flush. "Emily, I was trying to guide you, help you understand social dynamics. You were teaching me to be racist, Mom, just like you." The word hit like a slap. "Emily, that's not fair. I have never." Never what? Never judged people by their skin color. Never treated service workers like they were subhuman. Never made comments about those people when you thought no one was listening. Emily's voice was rising. "I heard you, Mom, all those years. I heard everything. Whatever I said, I didn't mean—" "You called our gardener a dirty Mexican. He was from El Salvador, by the way. You told the caterer at my graduation party that at least Asians know how to work hard. You asked Dad if his new VP was a diversity hire when you found out she was black." Margaret's mouth opened and closed. She wanted to defend herself, to explain context, to make Emily understand, but the words wouldn't come. "I spent years trying to unlearn what you taught me," Emily continued. "Years of therapy. Years of confronting the prejudices you planted in my head. Do you know how hard it is to realize that your mother raised you to hate people for no reason? I don't hate anyone. You called a man a monkey, Mom, on camera, in front of 300 people, and then you went on television and defended it." Emily's eyes were wet now, but her voice remained steady. "That's not a mistake. That's not a moment of weakness. That's who you are." Margaret felt the last remnants of her control slipping away. "Emily, please. You're my daughter. Whatever I've done wrong, I love you. I've always loved you. I know you love me, Mom. That's what makes this so hard. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is from Thomas and me. Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal letter typed with both children's signatures at the bottom. What is this? We're asking you to stop contacting us, both of us. At least until you've gotten help, real help, therapy, counseling, something that addresses why you think it's okay to treat people the way you do. Margaret felt the room spinning. You can't be serious. We're completely serious. Thomas wanted to tell you himself, but he couldn't face you. He's ashamed, Mom. Ashamed that his last name is associated with what you did. Ashamed that his friends saw that video. Ashamed that the woman who raised him is capable of that kind of cruelty. I'm still your mother. Yes. And that's the only reason we're giving you this chance. Emily stood up. Get help, Mom. Real help. Not some life coach who tells you what you want to hear. A real therapist who will force you to confront why you hate people you've never met. I don't need a therapist. I need my family. You can't have us, Mom. Not like this. Not while you're still defending what you did. Not while you still think you're the victim. Emily's voice cracked. I love you. Thomas loves you. But we can't be around you while you're like this. It's too toxic. Too painful. Emily, wait. But her daughter was already walking away, leaving Margaret alone at the table with the letter in her hands and the ruins of her family scattered around her. The apartment felt even smaller after that. Margaret spent the next week barely moving. She ordered delivery food she didn't eat. She watched television she didn't see. She slept 18 hours a day because being awake was unbearable. Her phone was silent now. No calls. No texts. Even the hate mail had stopped. Apparently, she wasn't interesting enough to hate anymore. On the 8th day, a knock came at the door. Margaret ignored it. Probably the property manager with some complaint about noise or trash, or one of the 1,000 rules she had never needed to learn. The knock came again, louder. Mrs. Ashford, I know you're in there. I can see the light under the door. A woman's voice. Unfamiliar. Margaret dragged herself to the door and opened it a crack. A middle-aged black woman stood in the hallway, carrying a folder and wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested government work. Mrs. Ashford, I'm Denise Williams from the California Department of Community Services. May I come in? What do you want? You've been ordered to complete 200 hours of community service as part of your plea agreement. I'm your case coordinator. The plea agreement. Margaret had almost forgotten. Her lawyer had negotiated it to avoid criminal charges, assault civil rights violations, creating a disturbance at a federal event. 200 hours of community service had seemed like nothing compared to the alternative. Now those hours loomed like a prison sentence. Fine. Margaret opened the door wider. Come in. Denise Williams entered the apartment, taking in the cramped space with a practiced eye. This is quite different from your previous residence. Obviously. No judgment, Mrs. Ashford. Just an observation. Denise sat down at the small table and opened her folder. You have options for your community service. Roadside cleanup, graffiti removal, park maintenance. Manual labor. Community service isn't meant to be comfortable, Mrs. Ashford. It's meant to be instructive. Denise flipped through papers. However, given the nature of your offense, I think there's a more appropriate placement. What kind of placement? The Houston Veterans Support Center. It's a shelter and resource center for homeless veterans. Many of them are minorities. Many of them have faced exactly the kind of prejudice you demonstrated at that gala. Margaret felt her stomach turn. You want me to work with homeless people? I want you to serve homeless veterans, men and women who fought for this country and now need help getting back on their feet. Denise's voice was calm but firm. Is there a problem with that? 1,000 objections rose in Margaret's throat. The indignity, the discomfort, the idea of serving people she had spent her entire life looking down on. But she was out of options, out of money, out of allies, out of everything except the 200 hours standing between her and a jail cell. "No problem," she heard herself say. "Good. You start Monday, 6 a.m. Wear comfortable clothes and closed-toe shoes." Denise left a packet of papers and walked out. Margaret stood in her tiny apartment, looking at the forms that would send her into the heart of everything she had spent her life avoiding. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret's Uber dropped her off in front of a weathered building in a part of Oakland she had never visited. A faded sign read, "Houston Veterans Support Center," with a smaller sign below, "Serving those who served us." She pushed through the doors into chaos. Dozens of people filled the main room, sitting on folding chairs, standing in line at a serving counter, clustered in small groups around tables. The smell hit her first unwashed bodies, industrial cleaner coffee that had been sitting too long. "You must be the new volunteer." A large black man approached wearing an apron and a name tag that read, "Marcus S., Kitchen Manager." Another Marcus. The irony was not lost on her. "Margaret Ashford," she said stiffly. "I'm here for my community service." "I know who you are." Marcus S. didn't smile. "Saw the video like everybody else. You're the wine lady." Margaret felt her face burn. "I'm here to complete my hours." "And you'll complete them. Kitchen duty first. We serve breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Between meals you clean. After meals you clean more. Questions?" "I've never worked in a kitchen." "Then you'll learn. Aprons are on the hook. Hairnets are mandatory. Wash your hands up to your elbows before you touch anything." Marcus S. turned away. "Welcome to the real world, Mrs. Ashford." The first day was the hardest thing Margaret had ever done. She washed dishes until her hands cracked. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She served food to people who looked at her with suspicion, hostility, or worst of all, recognition. "I know you," said one veteran, an elderly black man missing most of his teeth. "You're the lady from the TV, the one who poured wine on that general." Margaret said nothing. "Why'd you do that? What did he ever do to you?" She still had no answer. The days blurred together. 6 a.m. arrivals, 12-hour shifts. The endless cycle of cooking, serving, cleaning, repeating. Margaret's designer nails broke. Her salon-maintained hair grew dull and limp. Her hands developed calluses she had never imagined possible. But something else was happening too. Something she didn't expect. She was listening. At first, she tried not to hear the conversations around her. The veterans' stories of service and sacrifice, of coming home to nothing, of being abandoned by the country they had defended. But in the cramped quarters of the kitchen, surrounded by people who had no reason to filter themselves around her, the stories penetrated anyway. There was James, who had lost both legs in Afghanistan, and now lived in his car because the VA couldn't process his disability claim fast enough. There was Maria, a Latina who had served 3 tours in Iraq and now couldn't hold a job because of PTSD that made her jump at every loud noise. There was Derek, a black man who had earned 2 Purple Hearts and now ate at this shelter because no one would hire a felon. His only crime being a bar fight that started when someone called him the same word Margaret had used at the gala. "You got any idea what it's like?" Derek asked her one day while she was wiping down tables. "Having people look at you and see a threat, a criminal, an animal." Margaret's hand stopped moving. "No, I don't." "Course you don't. You've never had to prove you belong anywhere. Never had to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good." Derek's voice wasn't angry, just tired. "That general you threw wine on, the one you called a monkey, I served under men like him. Officers who came up from nothing, who fought for every promotion, while people like you told them they didn't deserve it. I didn't know who he was. Shouldn't matter who he was. Should matter that he was human." Derek stood up. "Thanks for cleaning the table, ma'am. Most volunteers don't bother." He walked away, leaving Margaret with a dirty rag and thoughts she didn't know how to process. Weeks passed. Margaret stopped counting the hours, stopped thinking of this as punishment, and started thinking of it as something else. She didn't have a word for it yet. She learned the veterans' names, learned their stories, learned that the man she'd avoided for weeks because he smelled bad was actually a former surgeon who had lost everything to opioid addiction after a botched back surgery. That the woman who muttered to herself constantly had been a decorated intelligence analyst before traumatic brain injury scrambled her thoughts. That the young Latino kid who never spoke had watched his entire squad die in an ambush and hadn't said a word since. These weren't faceless, homeless people. They were individuals with histories and hopes and humanity that Margaret had never bothered to see before. One afternoon, Marcus S. found her crying in the supply closet. "Something wrong, Mrs. Ashford?" Margaret wiped her eyes. "I'm fine. Just tired." "You've been here 2 months. You're not crying because you're tired." Marcus S. leaned against the doorframe. "What happened?" "It's nothing. I just—" She took a shaky breath. "That woman who came in today, the one with the baby." "Keisha. She thanked me for the extra serving of vegetables I gave her. She said it was the first time her baby would eat something fresh in a week." Margaret's voice cracked. "I've thrown away more food in a single dinner party than that woman feeds her child in a month. I've complained about caterers using the wrong champagne while people like her can't afford formula." Marcus S. was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing to see, Mrs. Ashford. Most people never have to see it." "I should have seen it. I should have known. But I was so wrapped up in my own world, my own importance, my own—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Your own prejudice?" Margaret flinched, but she didn't deny it. "Let me tell you something, Mrs. Ashford." Marcus S. sat down on a box of canned goods. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've seen a lot of volunteers come through here. Court-ordered church groups, corporate team building. Most of them do their hours and leave without ever really seeing anything." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they look at these veterans and see charity cases, projects, people to be pitied and then forgotten." Marcus S. met her eyes. "You started out that way too. I could tell by the way you held yourself. Like you were afraid you'd catch something." Margaret nodded, ashamed. "But something's different now. You're not just going through the motions anymore. You're actually present. You're listening. You're learning." Marcus S. stood up. "That doesn't erase what you did. Nothing erases that. But it's a start. A start toward what? Toward being a better person than you were yesterday." He held out a hand and helped her to her feet. "Come on. Dinner service starts in an hour, and Keisha's going to need more vegetables." Margaret followed him back to the kitchen, her mind churning with thoughts she had never allowed herself to think before. She still didn't have answers. Still didn't know how to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was trying to become. Still felt the weight of every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual racism she had inflicted over 53 years. But for the first time in her life, she wanted to be different. And that Marcus S. had told her was the only place change could begin. 1 year later, Margaret Ashford stood in that same shelter kitchen, but everything had changed. Her hands were rough now, calloused from months of real work. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, streaked with gray she no longer bothered to hide. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by practical jeans and a faded t-shirt that read Houston Veterans Support Center across the front. She wasn't doing community service anymore. Her 200 hours had ended 8 months ago. She had stayed anyway. "Margaret, we need more bread for the dinner line," Marcus S. called from the serving counter. "On it." She grabbed 2 industrial-sized bags from the storage room and hauled them to the front. A year ago, she couldn't have lifted one. Now her arms were strong, her back was straight, and her body knew the rhythm of work in a way it never had before. The dinner crowd was larger than usual. Winter always brought more people to the shelter veterans who had been sleeping in parks and under bridges, driven inside by the cold. Margaret knew many of them by name now, knew their stories. knew their struggles. "Evening, Mrs. A." Derek settled into his usual spot at the end of the serving line. He was one of the regulars who had become something like a friend. "Looking tired tonight." "Long day. We had 3 new intakes this morning, and 2 of them needed medical attention before we could even process them." "The system's broken." Derek shook his head. "Men and women serve their country come home damaged, and nobody wants to deal with them." "I know." Margaret loaded his plate with extra vegetables she always did. "But we do what we can." "That we do." Derek paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know, when you first showed up here, I thought you'd last maybe a week. Rich white lady doing her court-ordered time, counting the minutes until she could go back to her champagne and charity galas." "That's fair. That's exactly who I was." "But you didn't leave. Your hours ended and you kept coming back. 7 days a week now, right?" "6. I take Sundays off to do laundry." Derek laughed a real laugh, the kind she rarely heard from him. "You've changed, Mrs. A. I don't say that lightly. I've seen a lot of people claim to change. Most of them are just performing for whoever's watching. But you..." He shook his head. "You're different now. Actually different." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had heard versions of this sentiment before from Marcus S., from the other staff, from veterans she had served for months. But it still hit her every time. Because she knew it was true. She was different. Fundamentally, irreversibly different. The question was whether different was enough. That night after the dinner service ended and the kitchen was cleaned, Margaret walked home through streets she had once been afraid to visit. Her studio apartment was 10 blocks away, she couldn't afford a car anymore, and the exercise did her good. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Mom, it's Emily. Can we talk?" Margaret stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, her heart suddenly pounding. Emily, her daughter. It had been 8 months since that devastating conversation in the Berkeley coffee shop. 8 months of silence. "Of course," she typed back, her fingers trembling. "Whenever you want. I'm here." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "There's a park near your apartment. Mosswood Park. Can you meet me there tomorrow, 10 a.m.? "I'll be there." Margaret barely slept that night. She lay awake in her Murphy bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Emily wanted to say. Wondering if this was a second chance or a final goodbye. By 9:30 a.m., she was already at the park, sitting on a bench near the entrance. She had agonized over what to wear, wanting to show Emily that she had changed, but not wanting to seem performative. In the end, she had chosen the same practical clothes she wore every day. If Emily was going to accept her, it would be as she actually was now, not as the person she was pretending to be. Emily arrived at exactly 10 a.m. She looked older than Margaret remembered, more serious, more guarded. But she was here. That had to mean something. "Hi, Mom." "Emily." Margaret rose but didn't move toward her daughter. She had learned something about boundaries in the past year, about respecting other people's space. "Thank you for coming." Emily sat down on the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. "You look different." "I am different. That's what Dad says. He's been keeping tabs on you. Told me you've been working at that shelter almost every day for the past year." "I have." "Why?" Margaret considered the question carefully. A year ago, she would have answered with something self-serving. Something about redemption or making amends or proving people wrong. Now she understood that none of those things were really the point. "Because those people need help," she said simply. "And I'm able to provide it." Emily studied her mother's face. "That's not the answer I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Some explanation about how you've learned your lesson. How you've seen the error of your ways. The kind of thing people say when they're trying to convince you they've changed." "I could say all of that. It would even be true." Margaret looked down at her calloused hands. "But I've learned that words don't mean much. Actions are what matter. I've been showing up at that shelter every day for 11 months. I've served meals to thousands of veterans. I've cleaned toilets and mopped floors and listened to stories that broke my heart. I've done all of that not because anyone was watching, but because it needed to be done." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Derek Williams called me last week." Margaret looked up sharply. "Derek? How did he get your number?" "He tracked me down, showed up at my office in San Francisco, said he needed to talk to me about my mother." "Emily, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he would—" "He said you saved his life." Margaret froze. "What?" "He told me about a night 6 months ago. He was planning to kill himself. Had the pills, had the note written, had it all figured out. And then you showed up at the shelter for an unscheduled shift because you couldn't sleep." Margaret remembered that night. She had been restless, haunted by memories she couldn't shake. The shelter was always unlocked. Veterans came and went at all hours, so she had gone there to make herself useful. "He said you found him in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with a bottle of sleeping pills, and you sat down next to him and talked to him for 4 hours. Didn't judge, didn't preach, didn't try to fix him, just listened." Derek had been through hell. 3 tours in Iraq, lost most of his squad. Came home to a country that called him a hero, but wouldn't give him a job. Margaret's voice was thick. He didn't need someone to fix him. He needed someone to see him. He said you called his sister the next morning, drove him to the VA hospital yourself, visited him every day for 2 weeks while he was getting treatment. Emily's eyes were wet now. He said you were the first person in years who treated him like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. He is a human being. They all are. Mom, do you understand what I'm telling you? Emily's voice cracked. A year ago, you called a black man a monkey in front of 300 people. And now a black veteran is tracking down your estranged daughter to tell her that you saved his life. That's not a small change. That's a complete transformation. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. I wish I could say it was some dramatic moment of enlightenment, she said softly. Some single conversation or experience that made everything click. But it wasn't like that. It was slow, gradual, day after day of being surrounded by people I had spent my whole life looking down on, and discovering that they were more human than I had ever allowed myself to be. What do you mean? I mean that I spent 53 years building walls, protecting myself from anything that might challenge my assumptions, surrounding myself with people who looked like me, thought like me, validated every prejudice I had. Margaret wiped her eyes. And then I lost everything. The money, the status, the family, the identity. All I had left was this broken person who had never learned how to actually connect with anyone. And the shelter changed that. The people at the shelter changed that. They had every reason to hate me. Some of them knew exactly who I was and what I had done, but they gave me a chance anyway. They let me work beside them, learn from them, become part of something bigger than myself. Margaret took a shaky breath. I used to think that my family's money made me valuable, that my social position made me superior, but those things weren't me. They were just circumstances. The people at that shelter taught me that real worth comes from how you treat others, especially others you think you have nothing to gain from. Emily was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Then she reached out and took her mother's hand. Thomas wants to see you too, she said quietly. He's still angry, still hurt, but Derek's visit shook something loose in him, in both of us. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, hardly daring to believe this was real. I don't expect forgiveness. I know that what I did, what I was caused damage that can't be erased. All I can do is try to be different, to do better, every single day for the rest of my life. That's all anyone can do, Mom. Emily leaned over and hugged her, the first physical contact they'd had in over a year. That's all anyone can do. 3 months later, Margaret received an unexpected invitation. The letter came to her studio apartment, addressed in formal calligraphy on heavy cream-colored paper. Inside was an invitation to speak at the annual conference of the National Association for Veteran Services. The topic, Transformation and Service: A Personal Journey. Her first instinct was to decline. She didn't want attention, didn't want to be a symbol or a lesson or a cautionary tale. She just wanted to keep showing up at the shelter, doing the work that had become her life's purpose. But then she talked to Marcus S. "You should do it," he said, not looking up from the industrial mixer he was repairing. "And I don't say that lightly. Why, I'm not a speaker, I'm just a volunteer." "You're a volunteer with a story that people need to hear." Marcus S. finally met her eyes. "Look, Margaret, what you did at that gala was terrible, inexcusable. But what you've done since then, that's powerful too. That's proof that people can change, real change, not just talk. I don't want to exploit what happened for attention." "Then don't exploit it. Just tell the truth. Tell them who you were, who you are now, and what made the difference." He shrugged. "The people at that conference work with veterans every day. They need to believe that transformation is possible, that broken people can become whole, that hate can turn into something else." "Into what?" "Into whatever you call what you do here. Compassion, service, love maybe." Marcus S. went back to his mixer. "Think about it, Margaret. That's all I ask." She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she called the conference organizers and accepted. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., in a hotel ballroom that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of the gala where everything had begun. The same crystal chandeliers, the same expensive suits, the same air of power and privilege. But this time, she wasn't here to perform. She was here to confess. The organizer introduced her with a carefully neutral summary. "Our next speaker comes to us with a unique perspective on transformation and second chances. Please welcome Margaret Ashford." Polite applause, some curious stares. A few people in the audience clearly knew exactly who she was and what she had done. Their faces were skeptical, guarded, waiting to see if this was genuine or another performance. Margaret walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. 300 people. Just like the gala. 2 years ago, I stood in a room just like this one and did something unforgivable. She began, her voice steady. I poured wine on a black man's head and called him an animal. I did it because I was racist. Not casually racist, not accidentally racist, fundamentally, deeply, deliberately racist. The room was utterly silent. I'm not going to stand here and make excuses. I'm not going to claim I was drunk or stressed or provoked. I did what I did because I truly believed, that a black man didn't deserve to sit at a table with white people. That his presence was an affront. That putting him in his place was not just acceptable, but righteous. She paused, letting the words land. I lost everything after that night. My marriage, my fortune, my family, my identity. But losing those things wasn't what changed me. Plenty of people lose everything and learn nothing. What changed me was being forced to confront the humanity of the people I had spent my life dehumanizing. Margaret told them about the shelter, about Derek and Marcus S., and Keisha and the hundreds of others who had taught her what she should have learned decades ago. She told them about the gradual, painful process of examining her own prejudices, not just the obvious ones, but the subtle ones, the ones so deeply embedded she hadn't even known they were there. I used to think that racism was about burning crosses and hood rallies, she said, about obvious hatred that anyone could recognize. But the most dangerous racism is the kind that hides in plain sight. The kind that lets people like me go through our entire lives believing we're good people while we systematically dehumanize everyone who doesn't look like us. She told them about her daughter's letter, about the silence that followed, about the long months of working at the shelter without any expectation of forgiveness, simply because it was right. I'm not here to ask for redemption, Margaret concluded. That's not mine to claim. The man I attacked, Deputy Secretary Thompson, has never asked for an apology, and I've never presumed to offer one. Some wounds don't heal with words. But I am here to tell you that change is possible, not easy, not quick, not guaranteed, but possible. If someone as broken as I was can learn to see the humanity in others, then maybe there's hope for all of us. She stepped away from the podium. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Then another. Not everyone. Not even most, but enough. Margaret walked back to her seat with tears in her eyes, knowing that she had done something that mattered. Not for her own sake, but for everyone still struggling to believe that people could be better than their worst moments. Afterward, she skipped the reception and went straight back to her hotel room. There was a message waiting from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, but something made her check. Mrs. Ashford, this is Marcus Thompson. I watched your speech on the live stream. I have some things I'd like to say. If you're willing to listen, meet me at the Lincoln Memorial tomorrow at 9 a.m. Margaret read the message 3 times. Marcus Thompson. The man whose life she had tried to destroy 2 years ago. The man she had called a monkey, humiliated in front of his colleagues, attacked for no reason other than the color of his skin. He wanted to talk. She barely slept that night. At 8:45 a.m., Margaret stood at the base of the Lincoln Memorial, watching tourists stream past on their way to see the marble giant who had freed the slaves. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her. Marcus Thompson arrived at exactly 9 a.m., wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe she was just seeing him clearly for the first time. Mrs. Ashford. Deputy Secretary Thompson. Just Marcus, please. I'm not here in an official capacity. They walked in silence for a moment, falling into step beside each other as they climbed the memorial steps. I watched your speech yesterday, Marcus said finally. The whole thing. I don't know if what I said was enough, if anything I could say would ever be enough. It wasn't about being enough. Marcus stopped at the top of the steps, looking out over the reflecting pool toward the Washington Monument. It was about being honest. That speech was the most honest thing I've ever heard from someone in your position. Margaret didn't know what to say. I've spent 30 years fighting prejudice, Marcus continued. From boot camp to the Pentagon, there's never been a moment when I wasn't aware of my skin color, aware that some people looked at me and saw a threat, a quota, a diversity hire. He paused. What you did to me at that gala wasn't the worst racism I've ever experienced, not even close. But it was the most public, the most documented, the most impossible to ignore. I'm so sorry. The words felt inadequate, but Margaret had no others. I'm not looking for an apology, Mrs. Ashford. Apologies are easy. They cost nothing. Marcus turned to face her. What I wanted to tell you is that I've been following your story for the past year. What you've done at that shelter, the lives you've touched, the man you helped save. Derek told you. Derek's my cousin. A slight smile crossed Marcus's face. Small world, isn't it? The woman who attacked me for being black ends up saving the life of my cousin, a black veteran who served under me in Afghanistan. Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. I had no idea. Of course you didn't. That's the point. Marcus's voice softened. When you helped Derek, you didn't know who he was to me. You didn't know anyone was watching. You did it because it was right. That's the only kind of change that matters. They stood in silence for a long moment, two people connected by an act of hatred and separated by everything that had come after. I can't forgive you for what you did, Marcus said finally. That's not something I'm able to give. What you said at that gala, what you called me, that's a wound that doesn't fully heal. Margaret nodded. She had expected this, accepted it. But I can acknowledge that you're not the same person you were, that you've done the hard work of confronting your own prejudice, that you've spent the last year actually serving the communities you used to dismiss. Marcus extended his hand. That means something, Mrs. Ashford. It doesn't erase the past, but it matters for the future." Margaret shook his hand, the same hand she had caused to be covered in wine 2 years ago, and felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but something else. Recognition maybe. Respect. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you keep going. Keep showing up at that shelter. Keep doing the work. Keep being the person you've become instead of the person you were." Marcus released her hand. "And maybe somewhere down the line the good you do will outweigh the harm you caused. Not in the cosmic sense, I don't believe in that kind of accounting, but in the practical sense, in the lives you touch, the people you help, the example you set." He started down the steps, then paused and looked back. "My grandmother used to say that character isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you hit the ground." He nodded once. "You hit the ground hard, Mrs. Ashford, but you got back up. That's more than most people manage." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of tourists, leaving Margaret alone at the top of the Lincoln Memorial, with the weight of her past and the possibility of her future balanced on her shoulders. She stood there for a long time, looking out over the reflecting pool, thinking about everything she had lost and everything she had found. Then she took out her phone and bought a plane ticket back to Oakland. There was work to be done. 6 months later, Margaret was named volunteer coordinator at the Houston Veterans Support Center, a paid position, her first real job in 30 years. She still lived in her studio apartment, still took the bus to work, still wore practical clothes, and kept her hair in a simple ponytail. Emily came to visit once a month now. Thomas had started calling again, awkward conversations at first, then longer ones, then something approaching real connection. Richard had remarried, but they had found a way to be cordial for the sake of their children. The shelter had grown under Margaret's coordination. New programs, new partnerships, new funding. The work was endless and exhausting, and more fulfilling than anything she had ever done in her previous life. On the second anniversary of the gala, the day that had destroyed her old life and created her new one, Margaret arrived at the shelter at 5:30 a.m. to help prepare breakfast. Derek was already there setting up the serving line. "Big day," he said. "Just another day. Not for you, not for a lot of us." Derek handed her an apron. "You know I never told you what I was thinking that night you found me in the bathroom. The night with the pills." "You don't have to tell me anything, Derek." "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about that video, the one of you at the gala. I had watched it probably 100 times by then. Every time I felt like the world was too cruel to bear, I'd watch that video and think, at least I'm not that woman. At least I'm not that hateful, that broken, that far gone." Margaret felt her heart clench. "Derek, let me finish. That night, when I was sitting on that bathroom floor, I was thinking about how even someone as terrible as you still got to live in a mansion while I couldn't afford a bed. How the world protected people like you and destroyed people like me. How there was no justice, no fairness, no reason to keep fighting." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "And then you walked in. You, the wine lady, the racist, the woman I had used as proof of everything wrong with the world. And you sat down next to me, and you listened, and you stayed." Margaret was crying now. She couldn't help it. "That's when I realized that people can change, really change. That if someone like you could become someone like this." He gestured at her apron, her calloused hands, the shelter around them. "Then maybe the world wasn't as hopeless as I thought. Maybe I wasn't as hopeless as I thought." Derek put his hand on her shoulder. "You saved my life, Margaret. Not because you were trying to be a hero, not because you wanted redemption, but because you saw a human being in pain and you refused to look away." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile she treasured. "That's the whole story. That's who you are now." The breakfast crowd started arriving. Veterans lined up for eggs and coffee, and the simple dignity of being fed by people who cared. Margaret took her place at the serving line, loading plates, making eye contact, calling people by name. She thought about the woman she had been, the wine glass raised like a weapon. the hatred spilling out like poison, the absolute certainty that she was superior to everyone around her. That woman was gone now, buried under 2 years of hard work and harder lessons. In her place stood someone new. Someone who understood finally that real worth had nothing to do with money or status or skin color, that it came from showing up day after day and treating every human being as worthy of dignity and respect. The line moved forward. Another veteran reached the front. Margaret smiled and filled his plate. "Morning, James. How are the grandkids?" "Growing like weeds, Mrs. A, growing like weeds." The work continued. The sun rose over Oakland. And Margaret Ashford, once a billionaire's wife, once a symbol of everything wrong with privilege and prejudice, served breakfast to the people who had saved her soul. Because in the end, redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about becoming someone worth forgiving. And Margaret Ashford had finally become that person.